So, Uncle Elvin, tell us about all that you can remember.
Well, first I can remember, I guess my first thing that I think to remember was a storm that we had in 1918. And I was, well, I must not even been 2 years old. But or maybe I was around 2 years old at the time. But we had this terrific storm, and it was blowing houses off their blocks. And my dad, there was another man over at our house, and he was helping to keep the doors. The doors wouldn't stay, they would blow the doors open, and they were having to try to hold them. The latches were just, as the house was bending and everything was just flying open. And one time they thought, well, maybe if we lower a window, it'll relieve some of the pressure. But I was, remember my mother holding me on her lap, sitting in a rocking chair. And we could hear things just blowing all over the place outside. It was one of these hurricanes that only happens every so often, but it blew. We had what they called a cistern. It kept all the water. It must have held several hundred gallons of water. It was in the back, and it blew it off, and our house went over the side off the blocks, and that's sort of my first memories of my father and mother. And then
your father was at the sulfur mine during the storm, or was he at home?
He was home. They were home, and I don't know if he was working at sulfur mines, and I just can't. I don't know what he was. Work. I was too little to know what was happening.
And tell me about what kind of work your dad did at the sulfur mine.
Well, later when we lived, we moved out, probably out in the country, and I was only 5 or 6 years old. He bought a house out in the country with 40 acres of land, and he was working at the sulfur mines then. He'd ride his bicycle. We lived about 2 or 3 miles from sulfur, and then it was about 2 or 3 miles on to the sulfur mines. I guess it was about 6 or 7 miles. And he rode that bicycle every day to the work. And when he'd get back, he would smell with sulfur so bad he would take his clothes off before he came in the house because they would just reek with that sulfur smell. As I got older, he'd tell me about running what they called a mud mixer. In the early days when they were taking sulfur out of the mines, they didn't bother to fill the caverns that the sulfur had been in, and they were drilling a well to take the sulfur out one time, and these people on the rig felt it started to shake, so they got down real fast and ran, and the whole rig disappeared. It fell in and just fell down into a big hole, and so they came up with the idea that when they took sulfur out, they would pump mud back into the cavern to keep it from collapsing. That was my dad's job. They had big pumps that somehow would mix mud, and then they pump it back into the caverns. And he did that until 1928, when the price of sulfur got so low that they were losing money, but they came up with a story that they'd run out of sulfur. But all the people that worked out there said they had plenty of sulfur left, but they were all laid off, and that was the start of the Big Depression. And my dad was out of work, and so he started trying to farm on this 40 acres. He would plow and plant potatoes and, well, all kinds of vegetables, and we always had vegetables and chickens, and we sort of lived off of the land. Very few things we have bought at the store because we really didn't have any money. But we didn't feel poor because everyone else was sort of in the same boat with us. No one had any money back at that time, except I had a few people that still had some kind of employment.
Well, had your dad been raised on a farm, so he knew how to plant?
He had been raised not too much on the farm because most of his ancestors did fishing and hunting, and they planted some vegetable crops, but he didn't know too much about farming, and we never really made any money out of it. It was mostly to survive the Depression. And we lived there. I remember I went to my first year of elementary school, what they called Vincent's Settlement. It was south of where we lived, and we went in, let's see, they didn't call it a bus. I'm trying to think of the name of it, but it was pulled by horses. It was a wagonette, I believe is what they called it. And it had some steps in the rear that you could get in, and it had two benches down on each side, hard wooden benches that we sat in to go to school. And it was pulled by 4 horses. They had a driver that sat up in the front on a big seat. That was in my first grade.
Was that when you lived on the 40-acre farm?
Yes, we lived on that 40-acre farm, and Bessie and Lily, they were older than me, and we had other neighbors that went. And I can recall one day they all got in a fight on the bus, and the bus driver stopped, and they all piled outside, and they were all fighting. And one thing that caused it, I believe some girl had pinned, with a safety pin, had pinned Bessie's dress up above her, and Lil was always protective of all of us. She was a fighter, and it seemed like everyone on that bus kind of got in a fight except me. I was kind of little. I was just in the first grade, and they were all called into the principal's office, and I don't know if he paddled him or what he did, but I was the only one who didn't get any punishment. I can remember that. And
so about how many children were on that?
I would say it was about 15 of us, 15 kids, or 20 maybe on that bus.
And about how far to school was
we
it?
had to go about probably 7, 8 miles to school. But the next year, we changed schools and started going to Sulphur Elementary in Sulphur. But my dad and then we bought a buggy, and we had a nice horse, a beautiful horse that Bessie and Lily would always wanted to drive this horse, but they wouldn't let me because I believe I was probably in the second grade at that time. And when we'd get to school, they would unharness the horse and tether it on a big long line, and it would eat grass around on the schoolyard. And then when we get ready to go home, they'd harness it back up into the buggy, and we'd take off back home. And this went on for a year, maybe. But one day going back, the horse stepped through a broken culvert and cut an artery in its one of its legs around its, just above the hump, right on its leg, and it started bleeding real bad. And we got home and we made it on home, and they started doing all these things. Mother and I don't remember if I don't think my dad was home. They were. Somebody had said if you put spider webs on it would seal it off, but it was too big an artery and it kept bleeding and it bled to death.
Mm.
And so then we, later they had a Model T school bus that came by, and we rode that to school for some time. By the time I was in the 4th, 5th, and 6th, I believe, grade, well, we rode this school bus. That was 1927, 28, 29, through that area. And graduated from, I believe, the 7th grade. We had a little graduation, I think, from the 7th grade, and then you went into what they call high school. It was only 2 levels in. From 7th grade, you would go into high school, and high school was 8, 9, 10, and 11. It was only 11 grades. About the, I think I finished the 8th grade, and at that time, my dad and they were having really a difficult time. It was right in the middle of the Depression. They almost couldn't support all of us. And my uncle and aunt down in Cameron said, why didn't they let me come down and live with them a while? And so they put me on a paddle wheeler, one of these old steamboats, and we went up down the Calcasieu River to Cameron, and they met me at the dock down there, and I lived with them for a couple of years.
Is that Uncle Joe?
Uncle Alec, and it's Stella. Her name was Stella. Well, they had 2 children, Jim and Lucy, and they treated me real nice. Jim was just a little bit older than me, not just a few months, and he and I hit it off. And my uncle had a truck business, trucking business, where he trucked. When the boat would come into Cameron, the only way you could get down to Cameron was by boat. They didn't have any roads in there, so when the boat would come in, it'd bring all the freight. And my uncle had this business where he had a truck, and he would pick up the freight at the when the boat came in, and deliver it to all the filling stations, and we'd deliver gasoline, and we'd deliver groceries to the grocery stores. And so Jim and I were the workers, and we worked with my uncle. He'd drive the truck, and it seemed like that was mostly during the summer. And then school started, and I attended school in Cameron 1 year. And the next year I attended, started high school down in, it was 9th or 10th grade, down in Creole High School. And one of the guys, one of the fellows that went to that school had a car, and he would stop by and pick me up, and I would ride. He had 3 or 4 other passengers, and I would ride with them to the school every day.
While you were in Creole and Cameron, did you get to know your grandmother, Fee, Aurelia?
She was had already died at that time. I got to know her when I was living in Sulphur at that house that had blown over by the hurricane. It was sometime when I was very young that she came up and stayed with us, visited for a short time, and that was most of the time that I knew her. One time I moved down to Cameron, she had already died. But
what was she like?
She was kind of a big lady, and she had her haircut was just like George Washington. It was kind of white, and it was just the same style as George. You look at it, kind of a George Washington look. And she always was chewing on some sea gum, or they called it sea gum. It was a black tar that would wash up on the beaches down in the Gulf. It was kind of a hard chewing gum. You could break off a piece and chew it, and you could chew it forever. But she had perfect teeth when I knew her, and she was in her probably 80s then. And it's always said it because she always had this chewing this sea gum. But my uncles, Uncle Adam, and lived down there, and one of my best friends was his son, Burton. Burton was about my age, just a few months younger. He and I did a lot of things together. It was almost like being in another world because you didn't get any news from the outside. All the time I was down in Cameron, they could have had a war or anything could have happened on the outside, and I'd have never known it because they didn't have radios or newspapers. Or you'd get a little news when the boat would come in. It would come from Lake Charles on Monday, and it would go back on Tuesday, and then Wednesday and Friday. 3 times a week it would go down to Cameron. It was one of these early paddle wheelers called the Borealis Rex. I really loved to go on it because I was, like I said, I was just a kid, and he had a black cook on there, and he'd always give me some goodie or something out of the kitchen. And I could walk all around down on the bottom of the lower deck. They had all the provisions and the stuff freight that they hauled.
So after you went to Creole to school for a while there, and after that, what happened?
Yeah, about that time I was, must have been about getting into the 11th, 10th grade, and my Aunt Carrie and Uncle John lived in Sulphur, and they were some of the, we'd say, a little well-to-do. They had, Uncle John always was a contractor and made lots of money. And Aunt Terry and Uncle John only had 2 girls, and she told me that I could come live with them. That she had a room, and while I was going to high school, it'd be better for me to finish in Sulphur. So I moved to their house, and boy, she always treated me, I'd say special, because she was kind of mean to, I thought Uncle John had a couple of his relatives, girls, that would come every once in a while, and they would call her Cousin Carrie or something, and but boy, she'd boss them around and treat them like slaves. But she'd have me sit there at the table, and everybody would wait on me, and I don't know, maybe it was because I was a boy and she never had any boys, and she even talked me into drinking, she said she couldn't drink coffee, and she'd heat up this hot water and wanted me to try it. So she'd put this hot water in my cup, and He said, put a little sugar in it. So I could drink hot water with a teaspoon of sugar, and I thought that was just like a beverage almost. It seemed to give it a taste, and it made her happy that I joined her. Uncle John was one of these guys that he was always, he was so sweet around her, and he called her all these loving names, but she would boss him around. Boss, she was really the boss of the household. And when he'd get away, he would slip into one of these bars, and sometime he'd come home, boy, and he was really, had been drinking, and sometime he'd have a bottle, and she'd find it, and boy, she poured more liquor down her sink. I think the pipes, I wonder the pipes were all rusted out or eat up, because he would hide these bottles around and she'd find them. He did a lot of work for the oil companies too. He would build these, wooden roads out through the marsh to the derrick so that people could drive their cars and trucks out to the well. And then when the well was brought in or they quit, well, he could take up these boards and use them again and make a running, it was all on boards, great big heavy timber. They make a floating, kind of through the marsh and make this road. I don't think I finished high school at her house. By that time, the Uncle Alec and a crew came up from Cameron, and my dad and them built, they bought a lot in Sulphur, and Uncle Alec brought this crew up and they built a house for us. I can't remember if I was already, it must have been about the time I finished in high school, because then I started getting little jobs, and when he finished that house, he put it in my name, and I got a loan. It was, I believe it was Ziegler Lumber Company over in Westlake. The only thing we had to pay was the lumber, because he had all this free labor and everything that built the house. And I was paying monthly. I had to pay on the mortgage $15, I believe it was something like that, a month. And I had to pay. By that time I was getting a few little jobs. I finished high school in 1933, and I had all these small jobs. By 1936, I was still looking for a permanent job, and I was walking down the sidewalk, and a man named Merle Vincent was the manager of a Ford agency in Sulphur, and he knew Mother, and he knew me, and he called me across the street and says, "How would you like to come to work for me at the automobile place?" And boy, I said, "I'd love it." And so he said, "Well, come on down." And so I went down, and they brought me into the office, and it was owned by a man named Huber over in Lake Charles, the agency was. And he believed in starting everyone at the very bottom that came to work for him. So they told me they would pay me $1 a day. But the office manager was Raymond Nelson at the time. He said, "Don't worry, we're going to raise you as fast as we can." He says, "You won't have to work for $1 long." Because even $1 he was pretty good, but the dollar was still not very much in those days. That was 1936. And I think I worked for 2 or 3 weeks at $1, and then he raised me to $1.50, and then on up, I'd get a raise about every couple of weeks, and till I was doing, helping the mechanics, and actually doing some mechanical jobs. one of my first jobs as a newcomer, the young man he'd been drinking too much, and he ran into the back of a Greyhound bus with a 1936 Ford, and he bit the frame, hit it so hard that the frame had bit, and so they ordered a new frame, and they went to the corner of the shop, and they put that frame down, and they put that old wrecked car by it, and said, now take everything off of this wrecked car, unbolt everything, and bolt everything that's good back on this new frame. So I completely built the car from, they got new parts for the parts that were bent, that had been wrecked. And I learned quite a bit how these cars were put together back then. Then they started giving me more jobs, changing spark plugs and, doing all the maintenance. And about after 3 years, the service manager, they fired him because, I don't know, he was chasing women, and they really were strict back then. Now it wouldn't happen, but what someone did on the outside, they thought reflected on their business. So they fired him, and they had him. I was the youngest guy in the place. I was, all these mechanics seemed like old men to me. But one day they came and several of the customers had told Raymond Nelson, who was now the manager, told him, said, I think Daigle would be a good service manager for you, or shop owner, because they always said I could smile when it was, and no matter if everything was bad. And so they made me a service manager. It was really ticklish for a while because I had to gave orders to all these guys that were older than me and had been there a lot longer. Some of them had been working for the agency for 10 years, and here I was a fairly newcomer, just a young kid coming in, and they kind of resisted at first, but then later I didn't have any problem with them. That was when we were in a small agency down by the old brick road. They wanted to build a new place over more on the highway, which was at that time it was
On Highway 90?
Highway 90, I believe they called it, and it was where all the cars went through. So they built a new place over there, and that was sort of, it started around the war. World War II was started. And
what was your dad doing at that time?
My dad, I worked from 36, and my dad died in 1940, so I'd only been working less than about 4 years. My dad had tried to run a Watkins. He had a Model 8 car with a little back where you could carry these Watkins products, and he would go down to Cameron and Hackberry and peddle it to these different houses. He would stop at people's houses and sell them all these vanilla and all this Watkins ornaments, and then he got ill again. He'd had tuberculosis back a few years before that. I can't recall even when, but he had to spend 2 years in the Woodman Hospital in Kerrville, where they'd treated him only with diet and sunshine, and they'd fattened him up, and when he came back he looked really healthy and looked like he was fine, but they never got rid of the tuberculosis, and it reoccurred later, and he started losing weight, and the last year or so he was bedridden. in this house that I was buying. We had a back room, and mother would wait on him and nursed him and took care of him until he died in 1940.
Well, when was it that they operated a store in Cameron?
He never really had a store in Cameron, I don't remember. He had one on the bank of the Intercoastal Canal right at a ferry.
Oh, okay.
We, on the other side of the ferry, going to Hackberry, there was a little store and filling station. It's always had a line of cars waiting for the ferry, and so lots of times you'd get business from people while they were waiting for the ferry. They'd come in and buy something, but it was only some little knick-knack or something. And we never really, he really lost money on that too.
About when was that? Before the Depression?
That was in about 1932, 1931, 32.
And that's when you were living in Cameron?
I was in about the 11th grade of high school at that time. And I was back living with them in the back of this store. I'd catch a ride with a man, he worked what we call graveyard down in Hackberry, and he'd come and stop it waiting for the ferry. And about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would catch a ride in with him into Sulphur, and I had a paper route in Sulphur that I would deliver papers, and then I would go on to school, and I don't know how I did it, but then after school I would go out for football, and then I'd have to hitchhike home, get out on the highway and go all the way back, and it was about 10 or 12 miles. Catch a ride back to that place going to Hackberry.
What was the name of that store? Do you remember?
No, I don't remember. I don't remember it had a name. But sometime we'd have another guy and I were both going out for football, and sometime we would get home till 8 o'clock at night after school. And I don't know how long that lasted. I don't think it lasted too long, but I was mostly a substitute player. I never was on the first string of the football team. Probably because I didn't put as much into it as some of them.
So your whole family was living together in the back of that store at that time?
You know, I can't recall where. I have a blank where Barbara and Helen must have been there somewhere, but I can't remember.
Well, she wasn't born until 35, so she wouldn't have been.
Oh, is that right? Okay, that's why she wasn't there. But I have some blank periods trying to think where Barbara and Helen were a lot of times when I was growing up there.
So you enlisted in the Army in 41?
Well, Helen and I got married in 41. We had already had our plans to get married, and then the World War II started. And Helen's uncle tried to talk me into us getting married sooner because he said it would make me a better possibility of a number on the draft. But we didn't change our plans, and we got married in 41, and I was still working at the Ford place, making a pretty good salary for the time then. I think I was helping Mother some too. Mother, and she had Barbara and Helen at that time, but that's a period I can't think I remember too much about. But in 1943, I was drafted. I didn't enlist.
Oh.
They drafted me. I went into infantry. It took me to first to Lafayette, then we got on another bus that took us to Alexandria, to Fort Polk, I believe they call it. Then from Fort Polk, we were put on a train and brought out to Oregon, Camp Adair, Oregon, which is around Corvallis and south of Salem.
That's where you did your training? Or
I did my basic training, and as soon as my basic training was over, they allowed us to live off post. We just had to report every day for duty, and so Helen came out from Louisiana, and we rented an apartment. So every night, one of the guys had a car in our outfit, and I would ride with him into Salem, and we'd spend the night with our wives and then family. We had Charlotte at that time, and next morning early we'd go back to the base, and I'd get there before the other guys even had gotten up. And I'd go in and sign back in, and the who was in charge would say, "Go wake everybody up." And so I'd go in and turn on the lights and yell at these guys. I said, "Get out of bed. It's beautiful." And they'd throw shoes at me and everything. They hated me. I'd come in and turn the lights and start yelling at them to get up. But, then after basic, I was sent to infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, to get more training in the transport. I was a transport corporal, and I worked in the motor pool. I had in charge of 5 jeeps. And so they sent me to Fort Benning, Georgia for 3 months. And so I found out I could get Helen to come meet me there. And so we rented an apartment in Fort Benning at a little town, Columbus, Georgia, I guess is the name of the town. And Helen met me there, and she got pregnant with Ronald. So she went back to Louisiana to her mother's, and I was, after I finished at Fort Benning, I was sent back to Oregon, to Camp Adair. When I got back, a lot of the fellows that I'd left had already been shipped overseas to fill in for, they had a lot of casualties over in Italy, and they had to go as replacement. But I still had a lot of friends that are still in Oregon. And then after a short time, we decided we were going to all go overseas, and so they shipped us to, got on a train and went to Leonard Wood, Missouri, to pick up all our equipment. And while we were there, they gave us new clothes, and they outfitted us with everything that we'd need for overseas in the wintertime. And we were there about 2 months or 2 or 3 months. In the meantime, that was about October, and Ronald was born, and I tried to get a pass to go. You could get a pass if your wife had a baby or some illness in the family, they'd give you a pass. But because we were getting ready to ship overseas, they wouldn't give us anything but a 3-day pass. And so the sergeant, he knew where Lake Charles was because he had lived in DeRidder, and he says, "I'll give you a 3-day pass, but you can't get to Lake Charles on a 3-day pass because the transportation, you just can't make it." And I said, "Well, I'm going." He said, "Well, you know, if you're not back here, you're going to be AWOL, you're going to be busted back into private, and maybe put you in the brig." And he gave me all these warnings. And I got my 3-day pass, and And I started hitchhiking. Seemed like the first ride I got with a foreman on a tractor, and he went about 2 or 3 miles. Fort Leonard Wood is way over, and I had to hitchhike way across to the main highway that went from St. Louis down south to through Arkansas into Louisiana. So I was kind of going across the state, and I think I caught about 8 or 10 rides with people that were just going a short distance, and I was really getting discouraged. It was 11 o'clock at night, and I'd been all day getting that far, and I was still in Missouri. And I was on the side, but I'd made it to the side of the main highway that goes down from St. Louis, and another soldier happened to be along, and he came and joined me. And I remember saying a few prayers while I was really getting discouraged. And well, a car came along and he stopped. He said he'd be glad to give us a ride. So we got in, and this other soldier said, "Oh, I'm just going to Arkansas." He wasn't going very far. And the man asked me where I was going. I said, "Well, I'm going to Lake Charles." He says, "Gosh," he said, "I'm going to Alexandria, Louisiana, and you're welcome to ride with me." And we started talking, and I told him what fix I was in. I was going down there and I had to get back. And he said, "Well, I'm just going to be down there a day, and tomorrow, one day, and then the next day I'll be heading back to St. Louis. And you're welcome to ride with me back to St. Louis." And I said, "Well, boy, that's really great, because my prayers were answered." Got to Alexandria, and the train, I seemed to make connection. I got on the train and it took me right into Lake Charles. Got there and visited and spent the night, saw Ronald, and the next day I got back on this train. I think it was Missouri Pacific or one of them. Took me back to Alec, and I found this man in this big, it's in that hotel. It's a famous hotel in Alexandria. I can't remember. It's a beautiful old hotel. And I joined him there, and I got in the car with him, and we went all the way back to St. Louis. And what was a miracle about it at the time, because people were having trouble getting gasoline just to go a few miles. And this man was doing some business with the government, with maybe a war effort, and he had a big tank built into his trunk of his car to carry. He must have carried 100 gallons of gasoline. It looked like, I don't know how many gallons, but he had a big storage tank, and I don't remember ever stopping for gasoline. We just seemed like it made it all the way. I got back to St. Louis, and from St. Louis, the Army had a shuttle that went from Leonard Wood into St. Louis, and I got on that shuttle and made it back to camp, and Sergeant just couldn't believe I'd been to Louisiana and back. He said, "I don't know, I just don't believe it, because you just can't make it there and back in 3 days." I said, "Well, I did." And short after that, and we were shipped out of Leonard Wood to Boston. We were going on to our post to get ready to go overseas, and we stopped at they put us up in the old fort. Well, they called it Miles Standish. I guess it dated back to the Pilgrims. I don't know. They had little pot-bellied stoves, and it was right in the wintertime, and you had to stand right in front of that stove to feel any heat. but we were only there about a week or two, and then we got on this big ship that was the largest ship that the United States had that were taking troops. It was the USS America, I believe, back in peacetime, and I believe they renamed it West Point or something like that for the war, and it carried about 10,000 of us or more. Our whole outfit got on it, and it didn't have to have go in a convoy. Most of the boats that were going across there, being submarines, were taking a heavy toll. But this boat was so fast, it said it could outrun these submarines. So we went zigzagging. They would kind of zigzag across the ocean. But we made it in 10 days. Went to Marseille, France. Went up through the Straits of Gibraltar and got to Marseille. It was very cold, I remember, and rainy, and we had to sleep in pup tents, or these little old tents that would only take 2 soldiers. You carried half of yours on the back, and you hook it up to another soldier had a half, and you'd put up these tents, and it was just for 2 people. And we were on this hill, and I can remember it raining in the night, and boy, the water just coming under our tent, and we were freezing and cold and wet. But we only stayed there just a few days or maybe a week or so, and our trucks and vehicles got in, and then we started our long trek across France to join in the Battle of the Bulge.
Were you on foot?
No, I was in a Jeep, and I can remember the whole convoy started. It was kind of a convoy, and we were following each other, and they stopped at some place, and at Christmas, I can remember it being Christmas Day, and I was alongside the road in a ditch, kind of eating a can of what they call K-rations. There was a can of cheese and a cracker and not much else. And a little French boy came by on a bicycle he had a loaf of bread tied on the back of his bicycle, and it wasn't wrapped in paper or anything. It was just tied with a string on the back. He didn't have any fenders or anything on that bicycle. Every time his bicycle was going, he was throwing dirt up on that bread. And I said, "Guys, how do you get the bread?" He said, he could say a few words in English, because he said that you get home, you wipe it off with a rag, and that's all you need to do. They didn't have any paper to wrap.
Huh.
And but even that French bread looked pretty good to me. But we went on in this convoy, and we stopped in. One time the convoy stopped, and we were went through a town, and these people come running out with coffee, handing us coffee, and some of them were pouring liquor. They'd give us a coffee, and then they had liquor to pour in it. I don't know what kind of liquor they were putting in it, but they seemed like they were very friendly and happy to see us, I guess. And then we went on up, and one night we slept in a barn where it was just hay. A bunch of hay, and some of us were up in the loft with all these bales of hay, and they warned these soldiers not to smoke up there. So I guess they didn't, because we didn't have any trouble. But we got up to where the fighting was, and we dug in, and the first night we were involved in a big battle, and three of our officers were killed. It was just a freak kind of a thing, because the Germans were shooting these big shell 88s, we call them, and they were coming over, and it happened to land just where our captain and two other officers, they were conversing or talking what they were going to do, and it landed, and it killed the captain and one other officer, and it wounded the other one. So we lost three of our officers, and it had one that was off. He didn't get hurt. That put him in charge of the whole company, and he was very green. He didn't know what to do, so he had to ask everything he made a move. He would ask the first sergeant. The first sergeant was an old army soldier and he'd been around. He knew the ropes, so he gave instructions to and this lieutenant would get his information. I always thought it was good we had a first sergeant that knew the ropes. But our discipline was very bad from then on, because this guy didn't know how to handle troops. Then we moved to a new location, and I had the vehicles, we call it a motor pool, and I had these 5 Jeeps, and we had a maintenance truck, and we had several other vehicles, and we got between two, kind of a valley, I guess you'd call it. Had a big hill on one side and a hill on the other, and when the Germans would fire these 88s at us, if it cleared that one hill, it would make it to the next, and we were sort of protected by being in this valley part with our vehicles. But our main infantry troops were dug in front of us about a mile away, and they had the machine gun, and they all were in foxholes with their rifles. And this was right in the middle of winter. It was the worst winter. We found out later that, like they say, it happens every 100 years or so. We had snow, and we were just freezing. And there was a sort of a lull in the fighting. It was mostly the Germans on one side and we on the other. And nobody was making any move. We heard later that they was kind of waiting. Our troops were waiting for the Russians to get into Berlin, and so we had to just hold what we were doing to wait for them. They announced while we were just making this holding operation, it says we're going to have a drawing, and one out of each company will be able to go to Paris for 5 days. And boy, we were all happy, but there were only one. So, and I had made a good friend with this young Polish kid. I was sort of older. I was 26, 27, I don't know, something like that. And he was 18 years old. And he was one of the infantrymen that was dug in to the hillside up there, and they drew his name. And he came up to me and he said, I don't want to go. He says, I'd like for you to go in my place. And I said, oh, come on. Gosh, you're missing a big opportunity to get away from this place. And he said, no, I made up my mind. He said, I want you can go in my place. I said, well, they won't let you do that. And he said, let's go talk to them. We went to the first sergeant and told him. He told them what he wanted to do, and they almost made it. refused his wishes, but he finally convinced them that he wanted me to go in his place, and they said okay. And so guy in charge says, "We just got a big shipment of cigarettes in." He says, "You need to take those for trading material." Well, I'd even told my buddy that, I said, "I don't even have any money." And he said, "I'll loan you some." He was so insistent that I go in his place and he's going to loan me the money. So I was tickled to go. Gosh, I'll do anything to get away from there. But I hated it. To think that he would, after drawing his name, he was going to refuse. But they gave me, I got a big duffel bag and they started throwing these cartons of cigarettes in. I must have had about 12 or 14 cartons. I didn't smoke, so it was just trading material. I didn't even know the value of it at the time, but I was being on the front. We were out of the action, but the story just came to mind recently when we moved in Palo Alto here into our new apartment, and Charlotte was, our daughter was going through some things, and she found she has this doll that, and she asked me if I could tell her something about this doll that I'd given her when she was a child, and it recalled this whole incident of me when I picked up these cigarettes, and I was getting ready to go to Paris. I got that duffel bag and just a few changes of clothes, and they had a big truck that picked up some other soldiers from other units that were going, that had been drawn, their names drawn, and so we started off to Paris. I don't know, to this day, I don't know what route we took. I guess they had to go which roads that were open, and we went for several hours, and then we stopped for the night in some little town. And I wish I would recall the name of the town, but when they let us out, and I really can't even remember where I even slept that night, or where they put us up. I was walking down this little sidewalk, and there was a very little store. It looked like a little hardware store. It was off to the side, and it had this beautiful little doll in the window. And so I went inside. I bargained with the guy. He had it marked up to a certain price, but I had all these cigarettes. And that's when I really found the value of cigarettes. I gave him only a few packages of cigarettes, and I got that doll. And I carried it with me till we got to Paris, and I was able to get it into a box and shipped it home to Charlotte. This was right after Christmas in 1944. She has that doll to this day, and it's a beautiful little porcelain doll that has light brown human hair, and it was all dressed in kind of ethnic red and white costume, and from the looked like the north of France. Went ahead and they put it in different places, hotels in Paris, and they had all these tours lined up for us. I made all these tourist places, went to the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame Cathedral, and I don't know, we just had a wonderful time. Even the food was not too bad. We were just been eating rations out in that cold and freezing weather, and boy, the hot food really tastes good. But it didn't last long before we were put back on the truck. As 5 days ended, seemed like awfully fast. Headed back to our unit, and I got there right after noon, and someone brought me the bad news that my buddy that had given me the chance to go to Paris had been just killed. He was the only one killed out of all the guys that were lined up. Had been shot by a sniper. The sniper on the German side was up in a tree, and they knew he was up there, and they started telling all the soldiers to keep down in their foxhole. Well, for some reason, my friend, he must have been curious or something. He raised to look, and he was shot through the head. And so they said, "You're just back just in time. We want you to take one of the jeeps and go as close as you can to where they're dug in and to pick up his body." And boy, that was really some hard thing for me to do, but I drove up there and got his body and brought it back down, and we collected all his things, and I had lots of money then because all those cigarettes, and I'd sold some to some of these people back in Paris, and I gave the money that he had loaned me and put it with his things. The first sergeant and someone took charge after that, and makes you wonder why things happen like that, because he could have gone to Paris, where he would have been completely out of the action. You wonder how the events turn out to be. But it was a very sad day for me.
Pretty sobering. You could have been in his place.
Yeah. Only I wasn't really dug in where he was. I wasn't in the spot that he was in, but when you're on the front line, you're just have to get it from one chance as another. You're in the battle. So shortly after that, we were told to move, and so we moved into another little village and stayed there for just a few days. And they said we're going to start forward to move the Germans out, and we were by Saarbrücken, Germany. The planes were just coming over. Well, our planes were just blasting. We'd see plane after plane just come over and strafing and bombing ahead of us. We started walking, and we had to go through a minefield that was on this road. We were instructed to follow the leader. We would step in the same place that the guy ahead of us stepped and try to follow because we were walking. We could even see some of these mines. There were little box mines that were dug into, and they were not buried very deep. They were just capable of, you stepped on one, it would blow your leg off. So boy, I was very scared, but I followed this guy everywhere he stepped. I was right back of him. And we got into Saarbrücken without any more fighting. And we got there, and the whole city, it must have been a city of between 500,000 and I don't know, it's a large city, but all the civilians had left because our planes had been bombing so much. And our lieutenant and some of these had the bright idea, said, we want to have a parade formation to be one of the first to have it on German soil or something. So we all had to dress up in our best clothes that we could find and go out there and stand in attention where they could perform some formation and, go through all the things of having a parade. Then we went back to the some of these houses that we were going to stay in overnight. And by that time, some of these soldiers had found where some of these Germans had left liquor. And one of them found so much liquor in a place that he said, I'm opening a bar. And he fixed it to, and any soldier come in there and they could order. He said, I'll mix whatever drink you want. Some of these soldiers got very drunk. And they started shooting, and it was, gosh, I stayed inside because it was not safe to be outside with these guys all wild with their guns, and they were shooting up in the air and around. And here was this first sergeant and my transport sergeant and another was sitting in the kitchen of this house, and they had the kitchen table, and they had the bottle of liquor on the table, and they were all drinking. And I looked in the door, and one of them says, I'm going to shoot that cuckoo clock. And boy, he took his rifle and he started shooting at the wall over there. He just tore that cuckoo clock all to pieces. Well, I closed that door and I got out of there. I didn't want to stay around those guys. And this went on for about 2 days. I don't know how. No discipline. Some of these guys had found cars that the Germans had left, and they put some gasoline, and they were out of gasoline. The Germans didn't have any gasoline, but they would take some gasoline off the back of a Jeep and put it in these cars. And they were running up and down the street having a demolition derby. They would wheel their vehicle and hit another one, and they were just crazy. Finally, they decided we'd move on, and we moved on into Germany. We got a little more disciplined then, and we got into Wiesbaden, and they set us up in a big, beautiful home, I guess. Must have been a home for some very rich person, because it had grand pianos, and here we were just an infantryman taking over this beautiful home. Later we heard that some general came in and took it over. It's his, but we didn't have any generals around when we were there. And we stayed in Wiesbaden, which was a very beautiful place. It was a spa where the Germans would come for vacation and had these hot baths, and mostly our duties then were, at that time, was to just get these civilians, and we'd go around about 4 o'clock or in the afternoon and tell them all to go home, to get off the street. And there was a curfew that they couldn't be out on the street after a certain time.
Were you supposed to live in English or some in German or what?
In German. We had this phrase, Gehen Sie heim, gehen Sie heim.
Go home?
We'd go up and down the street in our Jeep yelling if we saw any civilians walking on the sidewalk. And after a certain time, if they went off the street, they'd pick them up and put them in overnight, kind of an overnight jail. And we heard later that some of the girls, these wild girls, prostitutes, I guess, they would try to hang out so that the soldiers would pick them up. Instead of going home, they'd stay on the street and be picked up so they could go down and fraternize with some of these American guards. This was after the war with, I can't remember exactly where, it was around, somewhere around there when the war ended, and then we were in occupation.
So it was right after the Battle of the Bulge?
Yeah.
And you had
After
Germany.
the Battle of the Bulge, we broke into Germany, and they just collapsed everything. We were following General Patton, and he was going with his tanks and just cleaning out everything, and all these Germans were just finding someone to give up to. And so we were picking up all these prisoners, and a lot of them had already thrown their guns away, and we were anxious to get souvenirs. So we'd get into a place, and boy, we'd try to find out who has Lugers, and one of the cooks came to me and said, "Hey, let's go to this next village. We'll be the first ones there, and we'll get us a pistol." So I said, "Okay." So I took him in a Jeep, and we went over to the next village, and we asked around, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, so-and-so has." So boy, I got a beautiful Luger with a holster, and he got one, and we started back, and I made a turn in the road, and boy, saw these German soldiers, and I slammed on the brakes. Here I was with a cook, and I don't know, maybe he had a pistol. He had the pistol he just got, and my rifle was down on the side, but luckily these German soldiers had already thrown their weapons away, and they threw up their hands. I think it was 8 or 9 of them. And so I stopped, and we lined them up, and I had my rifle. Of course, they had already given up. So I had him search them, and I put some of them in a trailer. I was pulling a trailer in the back of that Jeep. I put some of them in a trailer, and I put 2 or 3 in the back of the Jeep, and he stood up in the front, on the front of the Jeep, and like he was guarding them with his pistol, And we took him back to that town where our headquarters was, and brought him they'd set up a kind of a barbed wire jail, and we brought these prisoners down, and boy, we were kind of heroes here. We picked up prisoners, But later, one of the guys at that prison, he says, "Hey, you guys didn't search these guys very well. One of them had a big knife in his pocket."
Uh-oh.
I said, "Well, this cook, he searched them." And so we stayed around in some of those areas, and after the war, I was shipped to Frankfurt and then some of those smaller places, and our 70th Division that I was in, it actually broke up over in Germany, and they shipped us around to other divisions. His occupation. And I didn't get back home until 1946. I came back on a hospital ship, and it's kind of funny the way that happened, because I was up at Bremerhaven, and some officer decided had the bright idea that we should not be sitting around doing nothing. He wanted to get us out, and they called it close order drill, where you'd march up and down, and they'd give you the orders to go one way and another, and we all rebelling, because all of us said, "Well, we're going home. We don't want to be soldiers anymore. We've got enough of this." And so we decided to all go on sick call. And I had just a little touchy sore throat. So I went on sick call, and boy, would you know that when I told him I had sore throat, he said, "Gosh, we got some diphtheria going around. You're going to have to go to the hospital and be tested." And here I was supposed to go home in 2 weeks on this troop ship. And they put me in the hospital. And I said, "Gosh, it's just a little sore throat." And they said, "No, it could be serious." So I went in there, and they tested, and they said, "Oh, you got some germs down in your kidneys." I had to stay in a hospital then. They said it's nephritis, acute nephritis in your kidneys. You can't go home on a troop ship. Now you're going to have to wait for a hospital ship. So, boy, I was disappointed because I'd already written Helen that I was coming home. And I had to wait about a month longer for a hospital ship to come to take me home to get back to New York.
Okay, so you're going to tell about the crossing the Rhine?
Yeah, well, I was, someone asked how we crossed the Rhine. Well, because all the bridges were blown up. Well, the engineers had made a floating bridge. It floated on the water, and the thing, as you go, it was kind of, the vehicles would seem like rock up and down going across this floating bridge. And the incident that happened before we got there, though, we had stopped at some little village on the French side, and it was right in the middle of a place where they had a big winery. And some of these soldiers had taken our water cans and poured all the water out and gone in and filled our water cans full of white wine. And they all started drinking it. And we had a second lieutenant that was had gotten a battlefield commission. He had been one of us, and he was a second lieutenant now, and he was in charge of our outfit. And we started, and before we got to the Rhine, all these guys drinking that white wine, they were getting drunk. And he was one of them. Boy, he was as drunk as the rest of them. He was yelling and standing up in the Jeep and the truck, and they were afraid they'd gonna fall out because these Jeeps didn't have any top, they were just open. We got to that floating bridge, and just we started across, one guy yelled, says, "Let's all pee in the Rhine as we go across." And here they were standing up trying to pee off that Jeep, moving Jeep on that floating bridge, and I was driving one of the Jeeps, and I was just sure that one of them was going to fall off. But we made it across, and we made it to our barracks, and these guys were, they were wired up with that wine for several hours. And I couldn't understand why we didn't get in trouble, because no one ever said anything that I'd heard about it. I guess they were pretty lenient after we'd been in all that battle and stuff. They were kind of let the troops unwind, I guess, because they finally drank all the wine and got back to normal. Some of these soldiers were a pretty unruly bunch, and with losing a lot of our main officers, a captain and all, and we didn't have very good discipline. And later, some of them broke into a railroad car that had a lot of different foodstuffs, and boy, they were bringing that stuff out, and some of the German canned goods and stuff. And they were just kind of looting, and no one stopped them. So later they okayed it for us to pick up souvenirs and send home. I was able to find some things that I thought would be nice. I got an old fairy pistol that you shoot flares up in the sky for distress, and I have a dueling pistol that goes back to where you used to have to load it with one bullet and put the powder in it, and I have German belt buckles and flags and things like that I still have in my collection. I gave several things that were very nice that I wonder what happened to them later, because my sister Lil, I gave her a sword and scabbard that sometimes the German officers were wearing. And I gave several different things like that to different people that I lost track of who I even gave it to.
You said earlier that General Patton was leading from your troops. Did you ever meet him?
No, I didn't meet him, but boy, we really thought he was a hit because he didn't want to stand around and wait for the Russians to get into Berlin. While we had the momentum, we could have ended the war sooner, but politics, I think, came into it. They made some agreement that they would let the Russians get into Berlin at the same time we did. So we were just held up and not moving for some time. And Patton was choking at the bit because he wanted to go. He was always ready to take off in these tanks, and I think he was scared of these Germans to where they would all he would also have a loudspeaker and then ask them to give up, And in the infantry, we were following, and we were picking up all these prisoners. We'd get hundreds of prisoners because he wouldn't stop to take prisoners. He would just blast off the head.
So you said you came home on the hospital ship. Where did that arrive?
We left from Bremer, I believe it was Bremen, over in the northern part of Germany. We started off across the English Channel and we were coming across the North Sea, and it was in February or March. It must have been March or somewhere around that time. And
40.
We were hit. It was 46.
Oh,
1946,
yeah.
And boy, the seas were real rough. We was coming across the North Atlantic, and it was one of these Victory ships that had made a hospital ship, and that thing would get on a wave, and it would take it way up high. It seemed like about 40 or 50 feet, and then the thing would drop, and sometimes the propeller would be out of the water, and it would spin, and then when it would get back into the water, it would shake the whole ship, and it broke one of the shafts, and they had to call in repairs, and they had to repair it. And while we waited, they always carried us extra propeller, I believe, but they had to repair it, and then it took us around 17 to 18 days to cross the Atlantic, where when we went on this fast ship going over it, only 10 days. But I had all the comfort because I had a bed. Lay down in bed, and it was his hospital ship. Although I was ambulatory and I could go anywhere as I wanted, I was still listed as a hospital patient, and I'd made friends with a guy that he busted his knee. He was in the Air Force, but he wasn't a pilot. But when they got to one of these German airfields, all these planes were out of gasoline. So he got some gasoline and put it in one of these little planes and decided he'd take it up into the air. He thought, boy, I know how to do this. But the thing stalled on him just as he got up kind of high, and he come crashing down into a tree, and he busted his knee up. So they had him listed as a litter patient, but he could still go on pass and all, and I went out on pass a couple of times, went to a theater down, officers, he was from Detroit area, and he was really a kind of a feisty guy, we got to this theater and we looked around and all the seats were taken, all the best seats were taken down in the, where we were supposed to sit. So we went up into the officers' section. And some usher came up there and some little guy says, "Hey, you guys are not officers. You ain't supposed to sit here." I said, "Well, look at all these seats. They're all empty. And those down there are all filled up." And we refused to move. And they finally left us alone because so no officers here. We just take their place. And when we got on this hospital ship, well, he didn't want, when we got to New York, he said, "I might have some of my relatives meet the ship." And he says, "I don't want them to be carrying me off on this litter because I can walk." He went and talked to someone and they were trying to get permission so that he could walk off instead of be carrying. Because it was real funny. One time we had to change from one hospital to another, and he and I just had gotten in from a pass, and these guys were waiting to tell us that we had to move to this other hospital, and they told him, they said, "You got to get back in bed so we can pick you up and put you on this litter because you're a litter patient." And he got in there and they put him on there and he'd lean up and say, "Hey," and they were carrying him, and as soon as he got to where he's going, he jumped off, and it was crazy. But
so you arrived in New York, and then
we arrived in New York, and he got permission, but I lost track of him. I didn't see where he'd gone then. By then,
so you took a train back to Louisiana?
No, they put me in Halloran General Hospital in New York.
Oh.
And but I went on pass. I went on down to New York. I went to some of those shows, the music hall, and they had me on a diet. And the nurse says I was on a salt-free diet with this kidney infection. And boy, they had some bananas, and she said, "No, you can't have a banana because it has salt in it." I said, "These bananas don't have any salt in them." But they wouldn't give me any. So, boy, as soon as I got out on past New York, I passed one of these fruit stands, and I bought me a dozen bananas. And boy, I must have eaten about half a dozen of them. He said, "I don't taste any salt in the banana." And so then Halloran, I got across to the Statue of Liberty and did some sightseeing, waiting to be going again. Then they had a plane, I believe it was a B-26 or something, that they had rigged up with stretchers and beds in it. And so they told me they were putting me on this plane and moved me to Chickasha, Oklahoma, which was an Army hospital. And that's where I was discharged from. They moved me there, and they discharged me and gave me papers to go back to Louisiana. But I'd called Helen, and she met me in Houston. We spent a couple of days in Houston before we went on back to Lake Charles. And they discharged me with 100% disability because of that kidney infection. And I said, I protested. I said, "I don't have anything wrong with it. Why do you want to discharge me with 100% disability?" And they said, "Well, it may come back on you." Well, I said, okay. So I didn't like the idea of being discharged with a disability. Until I got home, and about a month later, I got a check for $232 for 100% disability. And I'd gone on back to work. In 2 weeks, I'd gone back to the Ford place and was back to my service manager's job. And they told me to come back as soon as I wanted to. So here I was doing my service manager's job and getting 100% disability from the Army. That lasted about a year, I got this notice that they sent me all the papers and to come down to New Orleans on the train and so they could re-examine me. Well, naturally, when I got down there, they examined me and they didn't find anything wrong, so they dropped it to 0%. So I didn't get any more money. But it kind of helped out for Helen and I getting reestablished back in buying stuff. When I went in the Army, we'd gotten rid of a lot of stuff because she had moved back to her mother's. So we had to buy a washing machine and some furniture and things back to our little house in Sulphur. Before I left to go to the Army, I bought this little house and I had it rented all during the war. We moved back to it till Mama Daigle moved to her house, and she wanted to give me back this house that I first bought way back there with that $15 or something a month on Stanford Street. She had part of it rented in the back, some rooms, to a guy named Stoots, I believe, and his wife. And they didn't want to move, but we finally got them out of there. So we got back to our house.
That's when Mama Daigle moved on to Carter Street?
That's when Mama Daigle, she had a garage that was in the back of Stanford that she had moved to a lot over in Crocker and had built, Uncle John and some of them had built it and remodeled it and made the house that she lived in. Probably all the time you knew. Things pretty much got back to normal then. I came back in 46 and Jeannie was born in 1949. And we stayed in that house on Stanford until Jeannie was about 6 years old, I guess. That's when we made the move out to California. That was 1956.
56.
So she was about 7 years old, I guess, when we made the move.
You've been here ever since.
Yes, we moved around in Palo Alto, but we basically been right here in Palo Alto all this time. We
40 years.
Yeah, it'll be 40 years in about July or August of this year.
You know, I'm a firm believer, that my story of when Ron was born and I was on the side of the road, the next car stopped and took me all the way to Louisiana and back to St. Louis.
That's a miracle in itself, isn't it?
I can't explain it.
Yeah.
How during the war with hardly any cars running because of gasoline, and then I say this prayer and this next car stops.
You know, the Bible says, honor thy father and thy mother that thy days may be long on the earth. I thought about how much you sacrificed for us and how God has blessed you. So, His word is true. It doesn't let us down.
I think back and I don't think I did enough.
Yes, you did, too. We appreciate everything you ever did for us.
Well,
Rob doesn't appreciate you making her eat her onions or whatever it was.